the Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another and a virtual edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning to you.
Good morning, Paul.
Are you in London or are you in Somerset? That's the first fact to establish this morning.
I'm in London. I'm in my office in the House of Commons because Parliament will be back tomorrow.
And we will come to that in a moment. Now, the very first point about this particular Moggcast is that I'm not going to ask a lot of questions about the Dominic Cummings affair, which I think has now been and gone, whatever it may have left behind. I'm only going to ask one question about it, which is this. A lot of the listeners won't know, indeed I'm assuming most of them won't know Dominic Cummings, and they will think, probably rightly, that were this another advisor in another place and time, he would probably have resigned. So the question I wanted to ask you is a very broad one, which is simply this. What is it that Dominic Cummings brings to the government that makes him so special and apparently so integral to its workings?
I think for once, unprecedented in all the Moggcasts, you've asked the wrong question. I don't think the question is what is special about Dominic Cummings. I think what is impressive about the Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister is fair and judicious and backs people who haven't broken the rules. And that seems to me to be a completely reasonable and wise course of action. That, yes, indeed, there has been a tradition of advisors being abandoned by their principals because of a brief media fandango. But the Prime Minister hasn't behaved like this, not because of the irreplaceability of any individual advisor, but because that was the right thing to do. And it is key that Dominic Cummings abided by the rules. He behaved to protect a child, which I think any of us would have done. He is, as it happens, a formidably able man, a very important driving force behind what the government is trying to get done. But it's the basic principle is the Prime Minister has behaved well and properly, whereas if you look back at the past, Prime Ministers didn't have the backbone to do that.
Wrong question or not, I'm going to try it again in a different form, namely this. What is it that he brings to the party?
Oh, Dominic Cummings himself is a formidably able man. He has both intellect and drive and a very successful track record. He has a considerable understanding of how the machinery of government works and also understands the European question very thoroughly. But it's not about Dominic Cummings. It's about the Prime Minister making a decision to be fair and judicious rather than to be pummeled, as some of us may remember from previous Prime Ministers, by a passing press storm.
Just a quick follow-up, because you've just raised the point yourself. You just said that he's very well informed or very on top of the European Union question. Is he important to the negotiations that are going back and forth with the EU about a trade deal?
Well, I carefully said he's very well informed about them, and he's been informed about them going back over a couple of decades, hasn't he? He was instrumental in business for Sterling, so his track record in this area is very impressive. But no, David Frost is leading the negotiations, and the government's position is completely clear. With or without Dominic Cummings. I mean, it's just clear that we are leaving the European Union on the 31st of December, and that is a fact.
How long have you known him for, and how would you describe him as a person?
Dominic Cummings, I've met him a few times over the years. I don't know him particularly well. I am more of an admirer of his and his capability than I would claim to be a personal friend.
Let's move on. This is to a matter that I'm sure you've kept your eye on. The Archbishop of Westminster is suggesting that the government is being too slow to allow the reopening of the churches. Do you think he's right?
You asked me a particularly difficult question because, as you know, my loyalty to the church and my loyalty to the government are both absolute. I think that spiritual succour is of the greatest importance.
In other words, you're suggesting the government should be listening to the Archbishop very carefully indeed.
I would always suggest people listen to His Eminence.
I think we'll take that one as read. I'm glad to be asking a difficult question rather than apparently the wrong one. So if the next question is difficult or wrong, let's try this one. Is it your understanding that the quarantine scheme that's being proposed and that will come in on June the 8th, is it your understanding that it will allow any exceptions or not in terms of countries?
It will include the common travel area. So the Republic of Ireland will be part of the common travel area, and there are special arrangements for the Channel Islands as well. So to that extent, there are particular exclusions.
You're not expecting to see any other exemptions over the weeks ahead?
I think the government's position is that that's a matter, that the sort of air bridges question is one that is being kept under consideration, but no formal decision has been made on any individual countries.
Might it be fair to say that for all that we read of backbench protests against the policy and claims that some ministers don't like it, it really isn't clear whether this is with us for the long term, even the medium term or not, is it? Because it's going to be subject to 3 weekly reviews.
Well, but surely that's right, that if you're putting constraints on people's liberty, you can't constrain them in perpetuity. You have a right as a British subject to come back to your own country and in normal circumstances would not expect to be quarantined. And therefore, if an exceptional power is to be taken, then it must be regularly reviewed. As with all the coronavirus regulations, they're subject to regular review.
So we might not expect to see it in place in, say, 3 or 4 months.
But that's the bit I can't answer. When we started the lockdown in March, I couldn't have told you that we would have had schools going back on the 1st of June because I simply didn't know. I don't know what the scientific advice will be. I don't know how the disease will develop over the next few months. And I don't know how it will affect particular countries and what the risks will be advised of by the scientific experts. So for me to start speculating about something that hasn't yet come in, the point at which it would end, I think would only mislead your listeners.
What would you say to your parliamentary colleagues who are opposed to the whole thing?
Well, that's the point of Parliament. I might say that's why it's so important we get back to a proper Parliament rather than the imitation Parliament that we've been having, because the opportunities to debate, to raise questions, to scrutinise will be much greater when Parliament is back. And that is a proper role of a Member of Parliament. It's to hold the government to account, to seek redress of grievance. And even when I disagree with Members of Parliament, I would never criticise them for using their constitutional rights.
Do you mind me saying you don't sound fantastically keen on this proposal? I mean, I asked you a moment ago, in effect, to mount a defence of it to your colleagues. And instead, you haven't done that. You simply said, I mean, quite properly, well, I'm the leader of the House. I'm there to listen to colleagues, and I'm very happy to hear anything they've got to say.
But that's because I am the leader of the House, and therefore I have a dual responsibility, as you know, both to defend the government to Parliament, but also to defend the rights of Parliament to the government, and that they have MPs have a really important role in scrutiny. Of course, I support the policy that we want to keep the country safe.
What do you find yourself thinking as you glance, insofar as you've tried to do so, over the Atlantic and see the current scenes in the United States of America?
It's a terrible tragedy, isn't it? The pictures that were shown were deeply shocking. The issues that have then arisen from that are hard for Americans to deal with, and it is a tragedy, isn't it? In the genuine sense that often words of great motive power are overused, but what is going on in America at the moment is desperately sad.
When you look at it, do you feel that America's made any progress at all in terms of race relations? In that, when I think back to my youth, I'm now 61. I think back and I can remember riots in the late 1960s. I mean, here we are, the best part of 40, 45 years later, and still an incident like this can provoke the most extraordinary reaction. The tensions between different groups of people, at least between black people and white people in America, must still, in some sense, be, these tensions must be very real.
I don't know whether you've read the Robert Caro biography of Lyndon B. Johnson. I can't claim to have read it, but I listened to it on audiobooks. And I think it's well worth listening to, or if you have more time, reading, because going through in the great detail it does Johnson's career, it really highlights some of the very deep-seated problems that he, LBJ, tried to deal with, and in a remarkable way advanced American society to the better. But inevitably, here we are 50 years on, and he didn't solve all the problems. But it's a book I would strongly recommend to Conservative Home subscribers, because it does set out some of the historic problems that go back really to the founding of the United States, even the settlement of the United States, and how they have evolved and how people have tried to tackle them and what has worked and what has not worked. But you can't take a nation away from its history in a short space of time, as we know only too well in our own country.
Just moving back for a moment to Parliament. I mean, you're back this week, and Parliament hopefully is going to return to as near normal as it can. What do you say to MPs like Robert Halfon, who are shielding and has said, because they're shielding and because others are shielding, it's really unreasonable to bring Parliament back in this form so soon?
Robert is a terrific man and a most effective political campaigner, as you know, and is shielding. So I am keen to be able to help people in his position as much as possible. First of all, he is a chairman of Select Committee. His Select Committee and all Select Committees can carry on meeting virtually. That's not being changed. And I'm very much hoping to be able to introduce motions that will allow people who are shielding to participate in some part of the daily proceedings. I think that is important, and assuming the technology all works, that with not having it as a one hybrid system, but allowing a small number of individuals to come in at particular points, assuming that can be done, which has different technical problems, I hope that something can be introduced very soon to answer that. But on the general point, the question that voters, listeners, Conservative Home subscribers must ask themselves is, do they want the manifesto we were elected on in December to be implemented or not? That the hybrid parliament not only reduced opportunities for scrutiny, say for the opposition to hold the government to account and backbench members to hold the government to account, but also brought the legislative process not quite to a halt, but to a go slow, that we had no public bill committees, we had no SI committees. We were doing about a third of the legislative business that we normally manage to do in a week. And therefore, we would simply not have been able to deliver on the manifesto if we hadn't brought Parliament back. And Parliament is there to do a job. To do it properly, needs to be meeting physically.
Just taking you back a step to Robert Halfon, just so I haven't misunderstood this, I think what you're suggesting is that there will be a small, or you're looking to see if you can find a way of having a small hybrid element working.
That's a fair way of putting it, for people who are shielding. So, people who are getting advice from the government not to do something are in a very particular situation for which I have sympathy and want to help if I possibly can. And that is under very active consideration. And I would hope to be able to introduce a motion this week to facilitate that, if not this week, early next week.
That's very interesting.
So I would say Robert's appeal has not fallen on stony ground. I mean, I like and admire Robert, and when he says something, I take him very seriously, even if his phraseology is that of an effective political campaigner and sometimes quite colourful.
Right. Well, that's noted. On to the next aspect of Parliament coming back. How long are you expecting divisions to take?
Well, I mean, that's a matter really for the Speaker, that he, having listened to Public Health England, came up with the suggestion that we should file past the dispatch boxes in the chamber and tested it last week. And I think his expectation is it might take about half an hour to complete a division in that way to maintain social distancing. And there are obviously other ways of doing it. I mean, there are plenty of space in Westminster Hall, which has been discussed as well.
Just for those who know something about the layout of the Commons, and perhaps a surprisingly large number of our listeners will know something about it, they will know something or will have picked up something about how MPs troop through the lobbies to vote. If they have to queue in a respectable, socially distant way in order to vote, where's the queue going to go?
Where's the queue going to go? In the test, it went out of members' lobby down the members' staircase and would then go on from there.
So it's going to wind up.
But there is a lot of space in the Palace of Westminster. It is not a small site. But I think Smith deserves a lot of credit for thinking up a scheme that could work and for testing it when he was told by PHE that the division lobbies would not be suitable. And he's worked very hard to do this.
Let's just pan the camera back for a moment and try and look at the big picture. The track and trace system is coming in, and there are conflicting accounts of how it's going. The lockdown is being eased. Cases of the virus are falling at the moment. And I'm not aware, I must admit, I'm not looking very closely, I'm not aware of any second wave abroad. Now that the genie, as it were, is being let out of the box, the lockdown restrictions are being relaxed. Up to 6 people can meet outside. Is it really possible to believe that the lockdown could be reimposed in the form that it originally was? Or is it more likely now that we're moving towards a situation that's rather more like what Ofsted would call special measures? So when an area is in particular difficulty, that's when the government moves in and closes it down, but you'll get regional or local shutdowns. You're not going to get another lockdown again like the one we've had.
As we've discussed before, I think that the lockdown has always been done much more by the consent of the British people and by compulsion. That people wanted to go into lockdown before the government announced it. They have followed the lockdown requirements carefully and have, to a greater extent, imposed them on themselves than they've been imposed by the police. And the police have issued remarkably few fines during this period. I think in the whole of Bath and North East Somerset, which is my constituency and the Bath constituency combined, I think there have only been 8 fines issued. So it's been something that British people felt they wanted to be part of. And my expectation is that if it were to prove necessary again, it would be the British people who would decide really whether they wanted to do it. And I'm sure that they would actually if they felt that that were necessary. On the other hand, if track and tracing does what it is supposed to do, and it has succeeded in doing this in other countries, you wouldn't need to have another major lockdown because you've traced everybody, they isolate for a fortnight, and that means that, yes, some people face stricter terms of lockdown, but the rest of society begins to get on with its life. So track and trace is very important in this and has made great strides. And I think 25,000 people are now employed and they can track and trace 10,000 cases a day. So it's in a position where it will very much help with the easing of other aspects of the lockdown.
Let me ask it'll be a final question, which is about the testing and tracing scheme. Let's suppose someone is tested and found to have the virus. Just how quickly do you think the system needs to be able to track down all the people with whom they've been in close contact and ask them effectively to isolate for a period? Just how quickly do you think that has to happen?
Oh, but speed is of the essence. It needs to be done as promptly as it can be so that people can then isolate in case they have caught the disease. So speed is crucial.
Are you confident the process will be done speedily? Because if it were taking, say, a week to find the individuals with whom the person who'd been found to have the virus had been in close contact, that would strike some people as being rather a long time, and it wouldn't be possible for the system to work properly under a circumstance like that.
It needs to be done as quickly as possible, but there are always practicalities in tracking and tracing people. As I understand it, somebody who has the disease will be questioned for an hour or so about the contacts that he or she has had recently, and those people will then be contacted. But it's about contacting as many as possible as quickly as possible. Not everybody will be contacted straight away because they may be hard to get hold of, but it's about doing it as speedily as possible. That's what track and trace depends on. And it is a good system because it allows other people to have constraints lifted upon them.
Just a last question. The government has made an offer of a path to eventual citizenship. I'm not sure all the details are quite clear, but a path it is for a considerable number of people from Hong Kong. It's pretty clear that relations with China are unlikely to return to the status quo ante, to the status quo that existed before the coronavirus broke out and gathered speed. How do you see the relationship with China going forward?
Well, first of all, I think the offer to British nationals overseas is absolutely the right thing to be doing. As you may know, I lived in Hong Kong for a few years, and Hong Kong was British, and these people were given a type of British passport, and it is right that we honour our historic commitments. I think our relationship with China is currently very much in the hands of the Chinese, that they must honour the memory of Deng Xiaoping by following the joint declaration which he agreed with Margaret Thatcher, and it was agreed by him and by her in good faith and provided for one country, two systems, and for 50 years of autonomy for Hong Kong. That 50 years of autonomy goes on until 2047, and Deng Xiaoping, perhaps the most transforming to the good leader of China in centuries of history, ought to have his memory honoured by that agreement and that declaration being upheld.
I'm struck in that answer that you stuck very narrowly. Of course, it's an important issue to the question of Hong Kong. You don't see any wider implications for the relationship with China from the coronavirus?
I remember when the joint declaration was being discussed, people saying that the Chinese would abide by it because China abided by its obligations as a matter of honour and of face. If that judgment turns out to be wrong and the joint declaration is not observed, then of course that raises much wider questions. I'm focusing on it not because it's narrow, but because it's fundamental.
Jacob, thank you very much. We've covered all sorts of ground, from the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster to China through track and trace. I've enjoyed this conversation very much, as usual, and look forward to having it again in a fortnight.
As always, an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.